Should we go in any particular order?
It's up to you guys.
I can go in alphabetical order.
That is D first?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. David Marchand is my name, 28 years old. I'm in Buenos Aires. I live in Buenos Aires currently and all my life. And I don't know why I started writing for Matajuegos. That's basically the history of how we founded Matajuegos, I think, for all of us.
Is that my cue?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So my name is Pablo Quarta. I am also based out of Buenos Aires, Argentina. And the reason I started editing of Matajuegos was because Santiago Franzani, which is the fourth member of Matajuegos who isn't here today, pulled me aside at a kind of a game dev meetup and introduced me to David and said, we should do something. And the conversation kind of went from there. That's you, Rumpel.
Okay. And everyone can still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm Florencia Rumpel Rodriguez. Everyone calls me Rumpel. I'm 30 years old. Oh, wow. And I live in Berlin right now, but only for a year now. Before that, I lived in Buenos Aires, like everyone else on Matajuegos. Except Santiago, who now lives in Córdoba. And I started writing in Matajuegos because I saw what Pablo, David, and Santiago were doing because of a Facebook post about an Adventure Time episode. And I kind of butt in and it was like, oh, you can do this. They wanted to do a book. I told them to do a blog instead. And they heard me.
I forgot to mention I'm also 30.
Yes. We're the same age.
Okay. All right. Well, so your site has like a really great sort of, I don't know if you call it like a mission statement or about section. So maybe just as a way to give a little bit more context on like sort of your site and why it exists is you say your site is about, quote, killing video games today to give birth to them again tomorrow. So why do you feel like video games today need killing? Are you pointing to some sort of specific problem or some specific hope you have for a way that they can be different?
I can start by thinking an answer on that. The Facebook post that Rumpel was talking about, one of the posts where Santiago and I started a conversation that eventually became part of what Matajuegos is today, was the comments on a picture that I have posted with a section of an Adventure Time episode when Finn meets an ant called Lieutenant Gamergate. And of course, the conversation went into video games because I was surprised that a character in Adventure Time was called Gamergate, even though of course Gamergate is a type of ant. But
right.
But I don't think it's a coincidence that we developed Matajuegos while thinking about problems in the video game community, in the video game world, in a post where we were thinking, at least partly, about Gamergate, which is the kind of reactionary gamer feeling that we would want to extinguish from the world of video games. So that is one part. Matajuegos is a blog that comes at games from a social perspective, usually from a political and very progressive perspective. So one type of thing that we may say that we want to kill, but at least we want to push back against, is the type of conservatism or square thinking that keeps games down and prevents them from doing the really interesting things that they could do in the future.
I totally want to kill it, though. So
how so?
It's in the name. I mean, it's in our name.
Yeah. Well,
Yes.
I think we share a similar commonality. I mean, the tagline for my site is, it's called "Don't Die," but it's also like, surviving video games, which is sort of intended to be, you can take it any way you want to take it. Yeah. So I agree with you. But I know there's two other people who didn't talk about, not everyone doesn't have to talk about every question, but it would be interesting to hear, sort of why that's the mission that you guys believe in.
It's just to add a couple of things. There is a double meaning to our name. Well, very literally, it does mean game killer. It is also a pun on the Spanish word Matajuegos, which is a fire extinguisher, in the sense of something positive, something that extinguishes a fire or extinguishes the fire in games in order to kind of save them in a certain sense, which kind of ties into the birthing them again the next day.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Rumpel.
I was going to say that I cannot read the word Matajuegos anymore. Every time I see it, I read Matajuegos.
Okay.
But you are saying something more important, so please go ahead.
No, I think that the thing I was going to add is the first kind of conversations that we had around Matajuegos and starting the blog had to do with, I think, two conversations in particular, with 2 points. One was a kind of a seed planted by Santiago, who came from cinema. He came from working on experimental animation and experimental movies and directing. And he had kind of come into the Argentine independent game community looking to make games. And he was looking for people who thought about games the same way film students think about film, about substance, about art, about how to create new experiences and meaningful experiences. And instead, he found people who were obsessed with retro games, who were obsessed with programming, and very centered on games as games and not as games as a way to transmit anything meaningful, any substance. There was very little talk about substance and a lot of talk about form and structure and what games really are and what games aren't. And he was looking for people who were kind of thinking more along his lines, and that's why he kind of grabbed us one by one, kind of forming a little Avengers team, as my
a collective.
Yeah, because we were kind of thinking along the same lines. We were thinking about we kind of wanted to fill this void in our local discourse about games and start to kill it in a certain sense by introducing other perspectives and other subjects.
Yeah,
that we thought were perhaps a little less representative and perhaps a little more meaningful.
Yeah, I don't want that to come on too strong for people who maybe aren't familiar with your site, or maybe you're hearing or reading about it here for the first time. My impression is I think that you have a similar philosophy or attitude towards this as I do, which is you're killing things with sunlight. It's not like a nihilist or a purely destructive goal. Like, you want to rebuild something better, and so like I saw that you publish in both English and in Spanish. I don't remember where you read this. Or where I read this rather. It may have been one of our emails or on your site. You said that you do this so that people from here, meaning there, for two of you there, know about the weirder stuff happening internationally, and people outside can read about games being made here, again meaning there, for two of you. So, I mean, what do you find usually surprises people to learn about games being made? I mean, I guess like in both directions. Like for your English-speaking language, like or English-speaking audience, I'm sorry. What do you find like is surprising for them to learn about games being made in Latin America? And for the inverse, like what do you find is surprising for them about games coming from quote unquote outside?
I think we don't have that big of an English-speaking audience, sadly. So most people who hear about us and are actually interested in what we do are other people who make, like in English at least, are other people who make games. In Spanish, it also happens that we know way more people who make games who speak Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
Pablo, David?
No, go ahead. I feel like I've
Okay.
already, so I'll pick it up at some point.
Okay, but you're the ones who meet most of those people. No, I think that I think the most interesting stuff with Matajuegos ended up coming with the Spanish-speaking side of things, mostly because other Spanish-speaking developers started talking to us and sharing experiences that were less like, oh yes, this is how you get more FPS on your shooter, and more like, oh yes, I feel the same way about, I don't know, how expensive it is going to TVC and do we really need to, or other people when we talk about successes in games being like, oh yes, I had similar experiences. Those people didn't approach us from the comments section of the site. They approached us in real life gatherings, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And also, what was really interesting was to see what the opinions of people who are really opposed to what we're doing look like.
How is that? Because I've run into some of that myself. You mean like critics, or just people who are just angry that you're doing a thing that you're doing?
People who are angry that we're doing a thing that we're doing.
Yeah, I've run into that as well. What do yours look like?
I don't know. Like a lot of it had to do with comment sections and people trying to nitpick stuff, but we really work up about the stuff they nitpick. There was one person who initially seemed like a cool person, and then we found out he decided to die on the heel of grabbing people's women's butts in the 60s was okay, and it wasn't. But he insisted that it was for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
And David, you met more people with contrarian opinions. There's that you actually speak to them.
Yeah, sure. I'm a big fan of getting into arguments on Facebook and Twitter, and you were asking us about the response from both sides, right? From more of an international or English speaking audience. Correct. And the Spanish speaking side.
Right.
The English speaking audience we have much less information about, because most of our audience in Matajuegos is from Spanish speaking communities, especially from Argentina, which is where most of us come from. We recently, in November, I think, had a lot of international guests for not for Matajuegos, but for a different type of event called Game On and the Gaia conference.
Right.
Yes, the Game Arts International Assembly, which was hosted for the first time here in Buenos Aires just this past November.
So that wasn't specific to Matajuegos, but we as Matajuegos met a lot of international guests that were coming, and they were very impressed with our work. They were, and we were very, very thankful. And we have that kind of impression on people who learn about what we do, who watch some of our videos in English, or who even the authors that we translate into Spanish that we published on our site, that they are impressed, that they want to help us in some way, even though we haven't yet worked out exactly how they would help us. And since most of our audience is from Spanish-speaking communities, in Spanish-speaking communities we know a broad spectrum of responses. From devs who absolutely love Matajuegos, from devs who tell us to keep fighting the good fight, to keep doing the work that we do, that is really valuable. Yeah. I mean, we try to, these past few months, we try to make up for that problem by releasing videos and podcasts. But yeah, for many years that Matajuegos lasted, the main problem was a lot of people told us that we were doing extremely great work, but they didn't catch up on all that we published because they didn't have the time to read our articles. And like with any project where you come at video games from a left-leaning perspective, you are going to either remain in obscurity or be known by a lot of people and face the more conservative side, the more hater side, the people who don't want you to do what you're doing. And we've had a lot of those when we complain about many of the things that GDC does. When Rumpel complained about that, we had a lot of angry responses about how we dare to hate on GDC. When I made a video game about the legalization of abortion in Argentina, and we as Matajuegos helped promote it and get help and get a lot of artists for the game, we got tons and tons of angry gamer comments telling us that we were making it for the money, or on the contrary, would never make any money out of it, or that we would put in politics on a game which was unheard of, or how dare we, that we were, or that politics on a game is fine, but we were being too extreme about it. All the spectrum of different complaints. And we've had that, and we've had to deal with that in many different ways. Every time we write something about feminism, which Rumpel usually does, we've known all the spectrum. So I would say when we meet people from the English-speaking community, it's usually devs who are mostly interested in avant-garde work and the future of games, and they are usually very supportive. And our Spanish-speaking audience is a broad spectrum that goes from overwhelming support to complete hate.
Yeah, I mean, why? I mean, this isn't the first I've heard of this sort of response. It's just, I wonder. This question is probably not answerable, but like, why is the culture around video games? Why does it want to be so regressive? Like why is that like even like it crosses like, you know, borders where I don't know. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush and say it's worldwide. But there is this pattern, you know, I mean, you mentioned something like Gamergate, which at least in the U.S. has, in these very small but loud pockets, has led to this sort of domino effect of other things being blamed on it, on people who, I mean, it gets sort of clunky and confusing getting into all the specifics of that, and we don't need to do that right now. But I mean, what's sort of the three of yours take on like why is it around like a form of entertainment that's so seemingly technologically advanced? Why does it seem to attract people around the world who are so they can have a tendency to be regressive and aggressively so?
I don't think there is a single clear-cut answer, like you say.
Yeah.
But I think that there has been a conversation over at least this last decade in the enthusiast press or the specialized video game press about what their responsibility has been or what their role has been since enthusiast press has existed, so at least the early 90s or late 80s, in creating kind of this consumer culture around video games that became very intense, especially around the 2010s. With that generation of consoles and G4 TV and this incredibly heavy-handed marketing towards gamers as a consumer identity, which I feel a lot of people bought into, or at least felt they had no choice but to buy into. It felt like that was how you consumed games at that time.
Well, so
and
is this a domino that's coming from the U.S. to other hubs of where there's a big audience? Because I mean, I'm curious about. I don't know. I'm curious about sort of like the ripples of, I guess, like colonialism and consumerism and capitalism and sort of, the United States is, whether they're aware of it or not, their influence on sort of all conversations about games. Because, I mean, are you saying, like, is this a thing where people in the U.S. may not be aware, like, how we're influencing conversations elsewhere? Or do you think is it just something about games in other cultures that they respond to in that way, and it can't all be pinned on the U.S., or it can't even in part be pinned on the U.S.?
But I feel unless we're talking about developer culture, which is I feel is different, place to place, locale to locale, region to region, I feel like consumer gamer culture is fairly monolithic, universal worldwide. I mean, with regional variances, but I feel because the market is global and the products need to kind of appeal universally. I feel like the consumers are the consumer culture is fairly universal. I mean, we can start talking about piracy, about how regional piracy culture is very different place to place. But if you're engaging with AAA games or with AAA consumption at that level, I feel the community is virtual. The culture is virtual, and since it is virtual, it is uniformly so.
Yeah, what I think happened was that when I was a kid, we had a lot of local video game magazines and some magazines written in Spanish from Europe and so. But then around from 2001 to say 2006, a lot of the paper publications started to close. A lot of it had to do with the economic crisis, at least particularly in Argentina, that we were going for at the time. So the way to get video game news started to be the internet. Like, I remember that around that time, I had to go on the internet. And the funny thing about the internet is that I didn't find that much content in Spanish at the time. Like, for instance, or content in Spanish that was safe. For instance, if I went to GameSpot, so For a while, GamesFAQ was the only website where I could find walkthroughs for games that wouldn't have porn ads all over. And some sites in Spanish had that problem. One of those sites was heavily advertised on a kids program about video games, like a kids TV show about video games. So what happened to me, at least, was that suddenly I had no way to read about video games on paper, and my options were the English-speaking websites because there wasn't much in Spanish.
Right.
Now there's more. Now there's more sites in Spanish, for instance. But it's like I started to consume a lot of English content, and it's like my gateway to that was GameFAQ.
Was there
Weirdly.
Was there a difference you noticed from the things you were able to read in print as far as like voice or tone or the things they focused on? Like, was there a difference in that from these U.S. websites to what you had been reading in print before?
So what I noticed in U.S. websites was that at some point there started to be more sites that did like video game critique.
Yeah.
Like they would analyze video games and so on, where with my experience with Spanish-speaking magazines was that, okay, you have this game and we have this review and we score a certain set of things like the audio, the graphics, the gameplay. We might tell you if it's kid-friendly or not, but in Argentina, no one would care about that. And in English, I found more stuff that dealt with games as art. But then that stuff started to, like, at least hegemonic view of games started to emerge once people started posting to the internet in Spanish. I'm not sure how that started, but from my experience, what happened is that paper was gone and I started reading English. And I don't know if everyone all over the world had the same issue where the magazines they were usually reading were now gone. They had to move to the internet. Anyone else had this experience besides me?
I think around what year was that for you, Rumpel?
So around 2003, I started to go to cyber cafes, and I started browsing the internet and getting stuff from the internet.
But around that time, I was living in the States, so there was still printed press as far as there was printed video game press, EGM, which was still very big. Game Informer, EGM, all those magazines still exist and were still fairly popular. They were still fairly central, I would say, to the conversation around mainstream games at the very least. I think websites independent websites and websites with alternative takes were starting to emerge around then, and I feel like what you're saying is more or less my experience in that they offered alternative views, especially around indie games, like indie computer games, which are kind of, at least that's when they started to emerge in my radar, when I started to see them.
But was Rumpel? Rumpel, were you talking about in print? Are you talking like early 2000s, you're saying you were reading things that I think I don't know if you said games as art or something, or games as culture. I mean, were you talking about like you were reading things in print, not on the internet, in print that were sort of talking about... I'm sorry?
No, it wasn't in print. It all started on the internet and remained on the internet. What I read in print was mostly the reviews of things.
Okay, I see.
So what I read in print was very review heavy or walkthrough heavy and so on. And then on the internet, there was things that talk about games as art.
Okay.
And also the walkthroughs and the stuff.
Yeah, you mentioned games
that I would get in print.
Right. Well, David, I mean...
Sorry if it wasn't clear.
No, that's okay. I wanted to... you probably were clear. I wanted to make sure that I understood correctly.
Okay.
So, I guess like the other end of this sort of pendulum, you're talking about with increasingly reading things online about games. I mean, you mentioned, David, that with your site, you have a particular focus on the specifics of making games in a third world context. And so you mentioned all these sites, all these other websites. I mean, how do you think, or for all three of you, I mean, how do you think English-speaking outlets, English writing outlets, whatever, could do a better job of, covering the games that come out, closer to where you live?
I think they should start caring about what happens in countries that are not part of the global north. And I think that on the Latin American side, at least, we should stop aspiring to be like the U.S., like having an industry of video games like the U.S. has, or being like Europe. Like, we should, like, on the side of Latin American, we should stop aspiring to be these things, because these things, like these foreign industries, have defects that we really wouldn't want to imitate. And on the side of the global north, I guess, they should care about things that happen outside their comfort zone and their nearest range of proximity, I guess.
So who's sending those messages out that's what the ambition is in Latin America, that the goal is to be like Europe, the goal is to be like the US?
Like, a lot of video game conventions are like not necessarily the conventions themselves, but the devs who go there are like, it was a lot like I don't know, we have one big video game conference in Argentina, and some of the devs were like, you can breathe GDC air this year. That is very good. So they compare everything to GDC. And it's not a reasonable bar, nor a bar we should be having in the first place. David was going to say something?
I wasn't, but I could. We
You're on now.
I mean, on the one hand, we do have a community-wide perception that people are trying to break into the U.S. market, but that's not only a prejudice on an individual basis. That also has economic reasons. We don't have a big enough. We don't have a big enough community of gamers in Argentina interested in games made in Argentina to make it extremely or easy or feasible to make games thinking about a Latin American market. I wish we would. But so then there are economic forces that push all of us to try to make games that, in order to be economically viable, have to, first of all, of course, be in English and appeal to a U.S. gamer sensitivity. I eventually made a video for Matajuegos, 2 videos about making games for Latin America, not only from Latin America, but also thinking about a Latin American audience, because I had read at least one article, but also I had sensed the prevailing idea that not only we weren't making games for Latin America, but that we shouldn't, that we would be well served to just forget about that specific goal and focus on the fact that we are not a cohesive unit of Latin American devs, a Latin American community. We are all devs in Latin America are more like individuals that each of us on our own have to break into the U.S. market, and that's a horrible way to think. At least if you're thinking that that's great and we should keep it up. So I have too many thoughts on the subject. Part of it is due to a very realistic assessment of the economic reality. Any big studio that wants to make a game that appeals only to a Latin American audience will find itself in big trouble. And part of it is the fact that we, as a community, look up to the U.S. maybe too much.
Yeah.
We look up to the U.S. for inspiration on how to break the mold, strangely enough, on how to make games that push the medium forward. So,
yeah, I don't know that we have that figured out up here.
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens
I don't know that that's necessarily the goal up here. It feels like, because I feel like I talk to other folks around the world who care about video games, and I find myself talking more about the time decades ago when no one was really sure what a video game should be or had to be, and it feels like we're in this sort of arms race of like, here's the checklist of if you're making this kind of game, all the things you have to do, where if you've played one, you've played them all, sort of, which I personally, like, that's concerning, you know, if, like, please don't look to us, because that feels like the direction we're taking it, you know?
Yeah, I think one of the things that tends to happen is, at least in the Argentine and Latin American dev scene, is that you tend to look at games that are performing well in the United States or that are creating a certain cultural cachet, and you try to replicate them, or at least you feel like games need to be made that way to be considered good. You say a good game has to be like these games. It's similar to these games. Instead of trying to figure out what games made with our own or with our own personal or cultural aesthetics or considerations could look like. And a lot of times devs think about that and they just make those same kind of games that exist in the U.S., that exist in the global north with local aesthetics or local references. Instead of thinking that maybe we can start considering the underpinning, the structural and design underpinning of games from our own perspectives and our own cultural considerations. And I think that's kind of what the videos that David made and that we published on Matajuegos are really getting at.
Yeah.
That we need to start having these conversations among ourselves instead of consistently looking at games made from the global north and that are successful in the global north as what can be made.
I'm not even sure. I don't know. I don't have a sense of how many people in the U.S. even are aware that we're having this, we're having this sort of impact, or that we're, you know, intentionally or not, like saying here's the standard to follow. I mean, David, you were talking about, I don't know if it was on email or time we talked before, but you know, you said that like the worst thing about this focus on like Anglophone games is nobody seems to have any idea how to stop that from happening. So I don't know if
Yeah,
you figured that out since we talked or when you wrote that to me, but I agree because it's like those sort of invisible problems are some of the most insidious.
Well, no, go ahead, Rumpel.
No, go ahead. They ask you.
Okay. First of all, since Santiago isn't here, I'm going to state the point that he would often make. That is that in Argentina, we are always obsessed with making what the U.S. is making. So we always end up, in our strive to make things that are experimental or new, we always end up basically making poor quality copies of what the U.S. was making 5 years ago. And strangely enough, we keep making it, we keep doing the same, and we keep thinking that it'll yield results at some point, and we have to stop that, or at least be aware that we're doing it. So mentally, we try to shift our focus to new things. Sadly, I don't have a solution for what you asked me yet. We're working on it.
Oh, I'm not
We're
asking for a solution. I'm just curious, like, as I'm sure, as I am, thinking about a lot of different problems or issues in and about games and their relation to other things. I mean, is there a particular aspect maybe for the three of you or any of you individually that, like, maybe not a solution, but what aspect of it is maybe really bugging you lately, or what are you really thinking about lately in relation to that issue?
I think one of the most interesting points that was raised at Gaia among different game curators talking about how the periphery could kind of leave its mark was for peripheries to start looking at other peripheries instead of looking towards kind of the global north, to start recognizing one another and start contributing and supporting one another.
I wrote an article about that a while ago. Sorry.
You did? Do you want to speak about that? Because that's more or less what I had to say, so I think you should.
Yeah.
You should tell me more, Rumpel.
So when I was really back at GDC because everyone was like, you should go to GDC. And I was like, it's not economically feasible for almost anyone in Latin America to go to GDC. Least of all, go there every year.
Right.
And I was like, hey, we're starting to have a lot of local events in Argentina, in other places of Latin America as well, where people share games made in Latin America, and in some places there are international publishers there, and they pick the games up and they publish them. So people have gotten publishing deals from going to a big festival in Brazil with, for instance, Devolver, and they didn't have to make the whole trip to GDC, which is really expensive. And Big Festival is fairly kind to international speakers and presenters, not so much to local speakers and presenters. So if you're from Argentina, and are going to Brazil, your cost will be covered better than if you are from the north of Brazil and are trying to go to Big Festival. But still, there's other places where you can go. You can meet with people from other places of the world, but also the focus is in Latin American games. So you have Levelui in Uruguay. There's a lot of events in Argentina. In the last couple of years, there's not as many as there used to be, but you have Vieva, you have Gaia now. We used to have a conference called EJ year number. So the last one was VJ 17 or something, which is VJ 17. So there's a lot of places where people from Latin America can go, share their work, and learn from each other, and learn things that will be more useful for the day-to-day craft. Because you usually cannot apply the advice that is given to you from people of the global north. Like, for instance, in Gaia, someone told me there was an event about running your own game duration exposition, and someone said, and that person said, the budget is around $3,000 to $5,000, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a budget you can feasibly have in Latin America. Like, reaching that budget would take a lot of work. Because no one has a lot of money, not even sponsors, for instance. So there's a lot of local events where you can go, show your game, and share it with other people. And even in Argentina, there's local events aimed at the local community. Like, we used to have an event called Muere Monstruo Muere, where people would go and show their games in a very indie space. The focus of each Muere Monstruo Muere was horror B movies mostly, but there was room for people to show their games. Like, I showed my games there a couple of times, and the reception was really good. And it was even better than the reception I got from video game events aimed at video game creators, because I got to show my work to people who otherwise wouldn't have seen it. So I got to share my work with the general public. And there was also so there's a lot of cultural community centers where people make events and you can go and show your game. And what I found out is that Twine is really good for the elderly to play with. Like, they really get Twine. So that's an insight I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And there's a lot of stuff like that. Like, if you share your stuff with the community, you will learn more stuff than if you try to emulate people who are very far away from you, both in geographical distance and in life experience and economical situation, I guess. Pablo, David, anyone?
No, I think there's a lot to be said for local organizing. I think usually, like, if you compare what it would take to organize an event locally and what it would take to fly to GDC and be in San Francisco for a week and try to attract the attention, spend the work time and the money to attract the attention of a publisher, it is perhaps a lot more feasible and a lot easier to organize an event locally with a community of local devs. And I think it'll be a lot more beneficial to the development scene in the area and to the general public's understanding of game development in your region. And I think a lot of that is lost when you have a game development scene, including an indie scene that is very focused towards business and to talking about games as commerce, games as a means of making money, as opposed to conversation around games that can be a little more open to the idea of games as art or games as games as art. I would say it is. I think David keeps making this point, which I think is very smart, and I think it's from I forget what article it is from, but he's always brought it to my mind that we don't expect most artists to make a living from their work, like from someone starting a band, someone starting to paint, even if they're successful. even if they're successful in their region. And I think it's very harmful to think of games and independent games as something that needs to be financially viable or business or to be a business in order for it to be successful. I think if we can consider the idea of games making impact in their regions or in their community as a bar for success, we start thinking of a lot more independent games as being successful.
I mean, David?
Yeah, I would say...
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I would say in the Argentine game dev community, going to GDC is thought of as a kind of a rite of passage, a pilgrimage that you have to do to become something serious. And one of the first steps that we would have to take to stop thinking of ourselves as individuals interacting with the U.S. market and start strengthening our own community would be to replace, or at least partly replace, our impulse to always think of GDC as this great mecca for us, with another tradition of going to our own local and more independent events.
I think the rite of passage for Argentina is to go to an EVA and go there to hang out with your other game dev friends.
Sure, and EVA is the Exposición de Videojuegos Argentina, our big Argentine exposition.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it. I mean, because I was just gonna say, I think David, you mentioned in an email that there's just too much focus in writing or thinking about games and through the lens of economic success. And I don't know why it's such a focus. I guess it's because, making games takes a lot of time, and writing or critiquing games is work. But there does seem to be. I was just thinking about like people I know up in the U.S. and their relationship with GDC. I mean, I have my own, but I feel like people I know in the U.S. who want to go to GDC, it's towards some sort of economic goal or some sort of career goal. I don't think that's unreasonable, but I do think it's unhealthy, and I don't know what we do about it. But I mean, why do you think there's such a focus on money in the first place when talking or writing or thinking about video games? Because at the end of the day, it's the same with like box office scores for movies. It's like it has no bearing on like what you get personally out of watching a really good movie, spending time with a really rewarding or fun or whatever kind of a game. Like at the end of the day, I think the things that we really get the most enjoyment or the most insight or the most of a distraction, from through games, you can't really put that onto a spreadsheet. So why does it seem to matter so much to so many people as far as like driving critique or criticism?
I was once in an Argentinian talk that was part of a small game design course that I think was trying to pitch, to get people into study game design in Argentina. And the way you study game design in Argentina is by going to a private school to one of the many private schools that cost a lot of money and study there. And they showed us the sales numbers for AAA games and how much money mobile games were making. And what they were doing was trying to reassure us, and some of the people there were young enough to still live with their parents, for instance. So they were trying to reassure us and the parents of some of those people that making the economical investment of studying video game creation would be worth it. And the teacher himself said it with those words. But it was a dishonest thing, sort of. But I think that's because people don't really get to see all of that money making video games anywhere. So I think what's behind the economical focus is that we all need to eat and pay rent and sometimes sustain our loved ones. And like video games still seems more of a viable career path than other creative fields. I think it has to do with it being related to computers. When you put computers into any equation, people think they will make money and that they are sort of more or less a serious profession. I don't know why. This is me just guessing things. But I guess that people still see a lot of video game making as profitable. And another thing that contributed to the myth of making video game making to be seen as profitable, I think it was Indie Game the movie. Like, a lot of people watch Indie Game the movie and were like, yeah, I can make my own indie platformer and make money. And it doesn't really work like that. But now we have this perception that at some point in time that was possible, for instance. In Argentina, in particular, there's a lot of people trying to make like their own, like there's a lot of entrepreneurial spirit, I guess, in the sense that there's a lot of small creators trying to make their own thing and sell it, like self, how do you say autogestivo in English?
I guess it depends on what part of autogestivo you're focusing on.
Yeah, but I'm guessing like there's a lot of people who make, I don't know, their own T-shirts or flower pots or notebooks or whatever and sell them, or their own comic books and sell them to people in fairs open to the public. So there's a lot of culture of making your own thing in Argentina and selling it to make money. And I don't know if that might also, like, combined with the global narrative that games should make money, that people all go together trying to figure out, in Argentina at least, how do we make money out of games? But I'm just guessing.
Mm-hmm. I feel like perhaps in my own personal experiences that at least growing up with games, games were always a product. It was hard for me to. I wasn't exposed to the idea of games as something beyond a cultural product, something that I had to buy, something that was marketed, something that was promoted as an entertainment experience. Until much later on, until I started getting into independent games, and even independent games when they kind of first made themselves known, or the first known was when they were co-opted by places like the Xbox Marketplace, the Xbox Arcade, and there were these big these big successes, economic successes like Braid and whatnot. And I think there was an idea, at least at the time, around that time, that there was a vested interest in people thinking that they could make games as something economically successful, and I think most people who go into game development want to work on big games. I think there's people who have a particular interest in independent games and in games as art, but I don't think our considerations are what the majority of people who go into game development, at least at first. I don't think those are their considerations. I think I think rapidly, perhaps, it becomes they start to consider game development as something that can be independent, something that can have another meaning. But I think just from speaking and from knowing a lot of game development students, most of them are looking to big games and they want to make big games. And I think they want to enter those commercial spaces.
Yeah. I think we can... Sorry, I think going back a little to one of David's first questions about why do we have such prevailing gamer conservatism, one way of looking at it that I'm not entirely convinced by, but I've been entertaining this past few weeks, is that for the companies that drive or that dominate the video game industry, there is an incentive to create the kind of community where gamers would defend the companies and not so much the individual devs. There is an incentive to create the kind of community where people value games for how much money they can make, or that they especially value the games that can only be made by the big companies. So given that the companies that dominate the industry have this incentive, I would say sometimes it makes sense to me that video games are like they are, and I wonder what other entertainment industries do differently that helps them break that kind of default state that video games are in.
Well, I was kind of thinking about this while we were speaking. While we were talking, I think we often compare, the industry to cinema, and I don't know how much an Argentine film, how much money needs to make back to be considered successful. I imagine it's a lot less than an American movie or even a comparable independent movie from the global north. I'm wondering what those numbers look like, and I'm wondering if how achievable those numbers might be for a local game development or a Latin American game development studio. I don't know.
What I know from Argentina's film industry is that a lot of the films are made with funding from the state. And then they get showcased because we have, Argentina has laws that makes sure that certain films get showcased in certain cinemas, and there's state-owned cinemas that showcase those films, and there's a lot of video game people that were pushing to get the same funding, but for video games. And I know, for instance, that Santiago made a game because he got state funding, not from the cinema entity that gives cinema people funding, but from some other initiative, and that's how he was able to make one of his games, for instance. David, you're going to say something, sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, something I sort of bristle about, or something that kind of has confused me for a long time. I mean, I understand it, but just sort of the word indie around games and sort of some of the confusion that causes. I mean, in comparing it to film, usually, at least my impression or the usage that I've seen that's familiar is, in film, an indie film is something that's actually, quite personal, or it tells some very, very intimate story about someone's life or something about life. And in games, indie often just seems to mean a smaller team, like you were saying, just sort of replicating a version of something that's kind of big budget. And I guess something, to take it back to your site. I mean, I know David, and I'm guessing for the other two of you, I mean, David, you mentioned that there's just not enough interest in sort of smaller works that are pushing expressive boundaries, and maybe that's always gonna be the case. It certainly would have been true 10 years ago. It's true 5 years ago. But in writing for the Spanish-speaking world, I mean, I think that's one of the missions for your site, is writing about video games in new ways for the Spanish-speaking world. Is this an example of one of those new ways, is trying to spotlight, games that are pushing expressive boundaries, or what are those new ways that you're trying to push in?
Well, after November and Gaia, we've had a lot of contact with people who are taking part in efforts of curation. That is not specifically critique, but curating and shedding light over games that are doing interesting things. And Matajuegos has usually been a little behind on the curation department, because whenever we want to shed light on a kind of indie or artistic gem, our go-to mechanism for that is writing a detailed article, taking it apart or describing what it does. And in the last few months, I've seen people like Aaron Signal or Liz Ryerson advocating for a new kind of direction for games criticism, which is going more to the side of curation, of course, being critical and doing analysis whenever we want, but also taking the time to just point out and empowering little devs that are doing little games that are doing interesting new things. And I hope we can do more of that in the future. We have started a video series called Matajuegos. I made the first video where I shed light on, I think, 7 or so small games around a central theme, but we haven't released a second video yet, and that's something I would like to do much more of.
Yeah, and I made some small curational articles, like once or twice.
True.
And they were well received as well, which surprised me. And there was talk at some point to grab all the small games we were making, like we were playing, and put together a small Twitter bot and social media bot that will tweet about them, because we played a lot of those and we keep it to ourselves. But I was the one who was supposed to code it and got lazy and never finished. Sorry.
No, I don't.
And another.
Another
thing
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, David. Good.
Okay. Well, I was just gonna say. I mean, it's funny because I think. Sorry, my notes don't specify. Maybe it's weird to have quotes read back to you from years or a week ago. But I remember, I mean, there's sort of a tension in here, which I understand, and I think everyone who cares about video games and sort of where they're going understands. But I like the big thing I feel like I'm scraping against, both with the book I spent last year writing and with this interview series increasingly, is sort of how to communicate these nuances about games, like find like the bigger things they tap into that people, quote unquote, outside of video games can sort of tap into, which I think in some ways may sort of, quote unquote, solve or at least change the amount of noise around how much of this just sort of happens in small pockets, because it will be open to so many more people. So the people who are aggressive, maybe a much smaller, much quieter portion of it all. But I mean, David was saying something about like we should maybe try to find ways for games to become less meaningful to people who care too much about them. And yet at the same time, like, I always wonder like what this must all look like to people who don't really follow. Like if they stumble down to one of our sites, like they probably are just wondering like, really, you can think this deeply about video games? Like, so I don't think it's a question of being lazy. I think it's a question of, these are passion projects and they are things we deeply believe in. But like, not to get too existential, but like, why is this a cause that is important to you? I don't know that I could answer that question myself. I think for me, working on a thing like this for so long is a process of figuring out an answer like that. But you work on it collaboratively, so you may have a better sense of it just because you talk to each other about it all the time. So.
Oh, sorry.
No,
go ahead.
No, you.
Okay. No. So for me, I grew up playing games, and it was just like this thing I did growing up. But then, as an adult, I was having this very big existential crisis, and where I was because I studied journalism, and I sometimes write, but when I finished, when I got my bachelor's, this is the name in English, in journalism, I had this complete creative block where I wasn't able to write about anything for 2 years. But during those 2 years, I learned how to code and got a job programming. And now I knew programming and I knew writing, and apparently making games is a good combination of those skills, according to some people. So I was like, I could try make a game. And I spent several years trying to make games. And then after I made the first game, it was easier to make the other games, and I felt better with myself. And I found really good friends that now I don't see that often because I moved countries. But Pablo and David are really good friends, and I made them making this. And it's like suddenly making stuff and expressing myself, which in this case it was through video games, but I believe it can be done through anything, really helped me deal with a lot of issues I was having at the time, because it made me more confident what I can do, and it made me more comfortable to say what I think and to not shy away from conflict all the time. And so for me, games are important for that. And for me, my aspirations is that more people get empowered through game making and game sharing, and that we build a video game community that is more like sign community and people sharing signs than this commercial product that needs to be either popular or have monetary value to be considered successful. And I would like to see a model of video game creation and sharing and distribution where anyone can make anything and share it with their friends, and where everything has value because it has spoken to you personally about something you care about. Like, I don't know, you like cats, so you made a game about cats. And other people who also like cats are like, oh yes, cats are so like this. I get you. And something more along those lines. So I haven't been much active in Matajuegos lately because I moved countries, right, and I'm processing stuff. But I still kept making games and some signs as well. And it's a lot of fun. And what happens when I'm making video games here is that I share them with my friends, and I don't care about what other people might think about them that much. I care that I share them with my friends, and my friends are enjoying them, basically. So I'm very active in the Pizzi Discord, I guess, and everyone there makes like amazing stuff with this tool called Pizzi, and it's wonderful. And I don't know. Like, I want more things to be like that. Like, oh, I made a game and I share it with my friends or with my community, and they like it. And we have interesting conversations because of this thing I just shared. And I want games to be more like that.
Yeah.
But it's because it's what I enjoy of them.
Yeah, I mean, David said, I think he put it really well where he said that games still feel like the entirety of human civilization when I'm talking to people who make games, but they still feel like a weird niche hobby the second I step out of those circles. And that's been, my experience, and I think in a lot of ways, that's with all these interviews, like I'm trying to sort of dig into, because like on the one hand, like I totally agree with you, like, sometimes, forget the big picture stuff, just focus on the good it's doing in your backyard. And yet at the same time, it does feel like it's caused a lot of damage and it's caused a lot of problems. I mean, if it didn't feel like a weird niche hobby, you may not have felt the need to do what you're doing, with your site.
I think I'm on the same existential level, the same existential place as you are.
Yes.
Currently.
Yes.
And I do want to echo everything that Rumpel said, because
I agree. I agree too.
I think that's right. I think I completely second everything she said, and I think I got into games because I felt games could be so much more. There was a lot more to experiment in games, as opposed to other mediums that I was interested in. I thought games were a place where maybe the things I wanted to do hadn't been done, or I could play around with things. I could be a little loose in playing around with them. But as I turned 30 recently, and I also recently I worked for 4 years, 3.5 years, 4 years in game development professionally at a large company for Argentine standards.
Uh-huh.
And I recently stopped doing that. I mean, in this last year, I stopped doing that, and I've started to work here and there on other game projects, which haven't been as related to development. And as I start considering the idea of going back into development professionally full time, I keep wondering whether it's worth it. I think making independent games, and I think making personal games and experiential games, I think is super important, especially as it grows the medium and it shows that games can be something else. But as I start looking at the state of the world, and I want to start changing it, I want to make some kind of small difference. I look at games and I keep wondering whether that's where I should be focusing my energy, or whether I should be focusing it elsewhere. And as I look at the conversations and a kind of this contested battleground, which is the game's cultural landscape, and the conversations around, in so many places, so regressive and so restrained. And I look at other mediums like cinema, like prose, like novel, like literature, where conversations are so advanced, or can be so much more sophisticated. I keep wondering, well, why should I invest my time in video games? And obviously, it is to advance that discourse, advance that conversation. But there is a point in which it does feel exhausting, right? In which it feels like it might take a very long time for it to get anywhere, and whether it's worth our time in that sense. And I think there's things like speaking with people like Gaia, with game curators, with people like yourself, David, and with each other, when it does feel worth it. But when you zoom out of the large scale things, sometimes it's scary. Especially when you look at it, well, should I go into it professionally one more time? Should this be what I do day in and day out?
Please, whatever you do, make sure you still have the time to cook for yourself.
I made so much pasta last night. You have no idea how much pasta I cooked last night.
I wish I was there to eat the pasta you made.
We ate it all. Two of us.
Well done.
So much pasta.
Well, I have just one more question I can float to you all, and I mean, it feels like we're sort of getting to that point anyway, but as I promised up top, I mean, we did jump around a lot. Was there something that any of you wanted to mention that maybe came to mind, but just the conversation didn't go that way? Or is there something that's just occurring to you now you'd like to mention, or even ask, or just talk about?
I think Argentinian game jams, especially the global game jam, were a really good thing that I didn't fully appreciate while I was in Argentina. And now that I don't live there, I miss them a lot. Because there was a lot of everyone from all ages and all backgrounds making games. Like, I was at a game jam once where there were some little kids making games. They made a game in Construct about a zombie, and it had a storyline. It was a storyline a 10-year-old would make, right? But it was perfect. And here in Berlin, I didn't see the same energy. Like, I went to Global Game Jam. Almost everyone who was there worked in games, and then they also go to Global Game Jam. In Argentina, there was like all this respect for use whatever tool works for you, and here there wasn't. And I was really bummed out. And then I missed the game jams in Argentina, even if they have like a lot of things to improve on that go along the lines of being kinder to each other. They were doing a pretty good job, and I didn't notice that until I left. So that's my take. Like, that's a positive thing. It's hard to appreciate the things you have when you're immersed in them, but once they're over, like, you look them through another lens, and it's like, oh, this was so good. We need more 10-year-olds making games about zombies.
Well,
David, did you want to add anything? Because I wanted to add something, but I feel like I've just spoke a while. So, David, if you wanted to say anything.
I'm good.
Okay. One thing I wanted to add back that I was thinking about when you asked about the reception in English-speaking communities versus Spanish-speaking communities.
Yeah.
I think English-speaking communities are just generally surprised that we exist and that there are Spanish-speaking communities that make games and are thinking about games. I think that's been the consistent perception, is just that level of surprise. And often when they ask us what they can do to help, it's often my answer is nothing. We need to figure this out for ourselves and kind of keep growing and keep having conversation among Spanish-speaking people who are talking about games, writing games, making games. And I think Matajuegos in the Spanish-speaking community has been, I think the most enthusiastic reception has been from indie developers and from academics, actually. I think a lot of academics feel like who are interested in games feel that there are no texts that justify their enthusiasm, or at least not very few in Spanish. And I think that was the second thing I wanted to note as one of our main objectives in Matajuegos when we started translating English articles into Spanish was that there was a lack of discourse here. While all the discourse was happening in English, all the interesting thoughts were being written in English, and that in order to kind of act as a fire starter for our own local conversations, we kind of need to translate some of those thoughts and start talking about them in Spanish and consider them from our own perspectives, our own Latin American perspectives.
Yeah,
and I think...
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, the questions that I ask and that I asked you all, it's less about what are the solutions, because I realize that's been my journey with this over the last 5-6 years, is the solutions are that's not on my shoulders. Like, I came to realize there's just a true value in just helping there be more points of connection and just talking about, like, just understanding, like, what are the problems that we're trying to figure out. And so it's interesting, although I would posit not surprising that like ultimately we all face a lot of the same problems, and I think you're right, and I think that's a really healthy attitude of like, well, you have to figure it out for yourselves, which I think can sound a little like tough lovey sort of, but I think that's sort of the healthy and most honest approach, because as I had sort of indicated before, like please don't be looking to the US for for answers of the way forward, because I think that there are a lot of people up here who feel just as you do and sort of equally lost. Like I can tell you later, but just it feels like really for these sorts of issues to really sort of mend themselves, they have to sort of make room for other approaches, other people, other types of people. Because I don't know if it's a pivotal time or not, but I think that that's just sort of the right solution, is like just sort of to figure it out for yourself. So I'm not expecting any answers or solutions. I just think it's important to hear about it and to share and to try to figure it out together, just sort of where we are at this beginning point with it all. But I'm sorry to interrupt. Please continue.
No, that was more or less where I was going. That was more or less what I had to say. And I think, obviously, when people ask me that, they were speaking more about promotion, how they could promote us, and it's like it doesn't really help us to promote us in English. But obviously, I do feel like international discussion and conversation is important, and I feel a lot of those people who asked us who asked how they could help eventually came down to Argentina and had conversations with our local communities about a lot of these issues that we're tackling, and that was helpful to an extent in just getting them to consider the problems we were having regionally, or at least some of the conversations we were having regionally. I think, like you say, it's about making space for those conversations without looking for solutions to come quickly or for them to be easy to reach, because they're not, if we want to tackle systemic problems.
The one clarification I would make is the real conversation that usually happens is people ask us, what can we do to help? And we usually say, well, do you have any money? And then they say no.
No.
And then we say, well, then nothing. We have to figure it out for ourselves.
Yeah, this is true.
All right, well, this is a bit of an odd segue, but my last question to go from money to something like this is, and please interpret the question however you like, what do you feel video games have accomplished?
It's a tough question.
Too little.
A realistic portrayal of Norman Reedus' face.
And butt.
We can leave it there.
Mads Mikkelsen. Please don't forget about Mads Mikkelsen.
But his butt does not appear, just his face. I think Hannibal was far ahead of what's this game called? Of Death Stranding in that respect.
Yes, that is true.
What have games accomplished? I mean, just by definition, they've accomplished a limited but interesting exploration of interactivity, which I think is what ultimately draws me to them. Is the idea of how can we make interactive experiences or interactive art. But by and large, I think they've promoted a lot of the problems that we still have in culture and have addressed them in small places that are usually not looked at very much.
I think games have this great capacity for good, but also this great capacity for evil. And they are not channeling their capacity for good often enough. And a lot of what games have accomplished for me personally was having communities that I could hang out in, but also it made me think a lot about social dynamics of those communities. But it wasn't about video games themselves, like intrinsically, but more like things related to video games and video game creation. So we can stick to the Norman Reedus space thing.
I think maybe a more optimistic answer that I would give is that games have, in fact, expanded the horizon of artistic exploration on an axis that was previously not that explored, which is interactivity or interaction. Because if you see the differences between other artistic disciplines like music and literature and film, the main difference, at least superficially, is the medium and the human sense that they appeal to, whether it's by ear or by sight or so. And interactivity, of course, existed in the art world long before games came to be. But games have kind of structured their whole artistic exploration in the axis of interactivity, which before that was usually a kind of extra ingredient that you could add to individual artistic disciplines, and they have taken interactivity in this whole new path of exploration that I hope keeps expanding.
Yeah, I guess they made performance art more accessible or something like that.
And I think some games are actually generally fun. I think that's a good thing that some games have accomplished. I think it is strange for art to form. I have not had any other art medium for muscle memory. I don't know how to form that sentence. I have not had any other art medium lead me to form muscle memory that is still visceral to me. If I think about it right now, I think I know. Yeah, I think there's a visceral quality to some games which is fairly unique.
True, you have to perform games to perceive them, so it's kind of a very bodily interaction with the work of art in order to experience it. Usually, in music, the person who performs the music is the artist. In games, the person who is receiving the game and playing it also performs it.
Yeah, I mean, both of you know that I have phantom dreams and phantom memories of playing Smash Bros. And I can feel that in my thumbs, and I can see that in my head consistently. But I don't know how interesting that is to anybody else. But it is a very close connection I have to that game in particular. There's something else I wanted to add, but I can't remember.
That's okay. We can leave it there. That's fine.
I mean, we can start talking about synaptic cycles and dopamine loops, but I don't know how interesting that is.
Yeah, but dopamine loops can be used for evil, so that's more complicated.
I don't know if they can be used for much else than evil.
That's a problem.